I'd like to welcome you to our Austin family home. We're here with RCR Wireless at the first, could be annual, right?
Could be monthly.
Could be, yeah, that's right. Actually, our Austin Smart City Innovation Summit. And we're here with some, I would say, distinguished guests. We've had a couple glasses and maybe a couple bottles of wine. And so this is what's fun. We actually had a podcast. We sat around sort of Italian dinner style with some Italians, actually, and had sort of a really interesting discussion. And it was really fun to see the different kind of perspectives that come when we talk about smart cities. There's many different constituent components of conversation around smart cities. Our goal is to really have a chance to just talk a little bit about what's interesting and how do we actually move the conversation of smart cities forward. So we have really a fantastic panel, actually. And we'll start with over here to my right is Mark Parr, who's the CEO of Bandwidth Logic, who has, we learned a little bit about your background, all the way from, aircraft carriers to radar to, Navy carriers. So a bit of strong background. And where we first met actually was in New York City when they were building the carrier system that supports the underground New York City subway wireless system. And it supports today millions of riders a day. And we want to talk a little bit about, these guys have actually made a smart city project work. Imagine that, to millions of subscribers. And so Mark was both the chief technical architect as well as the CEO of the company. And he's worked beyond New York City now to a number of other cities throughout the US. Darlene Pope and I used to work together at a startup back in the 90s. We wired literally thousands of buildings for voice, data, internet services, and she's just really one of the thought leaders in the country around commercial buildings and technology. And she's hosted and actually sold her company to Jones Lang LaSalle, where she's now the Senior Vice President of Energy Sustainability, and really is responsible for over 3 billion square feet around the world of commercial office space, and has a very both well-educated and experienced background in commercial office buildings, and how that relates to the conversation of smart cities, where many times the commercial buildings are left out of that conversation. We have Chelsea Collier, who's my partner here locally. She's an amazing woman, been involved in state policy, been involved with a number of sort of initiatives here in Austin, and is really a thought leader and provides a lot of sort of blogging and sort of just thought leadership around smart cities, part of the Eisenhower Fellowship. And so we'll be hearing a lot more from her. But together we want to start hosting these, and this is sort of the beginning of our kickoff of Digital Cities. And I'm a co-founder of Third Drive, and we actually support a lot of these initiatives. We're doing a bunch of development around smart cities. We really want to be a catalyst to move it forward. So having said that as an introduction, this is sort of a conversation that's very casual after a few glasses of wine and dinner. And I just wanted to give you guys a chance to, when we talk about smart cities, what is one of your pet peeves?
Do you want me to go first on this?
Darlene, ladies first.
Obviously, you want to go first.
Cheers, by the way. Everybody, cheers.
Cheers.
Salud.
Salud.
So one of my biggest pet peeves is when you talk about smart cities, the first thing that you see when you look at a city are the buildings. And so you can't talk about smart cities without talking about smart buildings. So my passion, my history and experience has been primarily in the built environment, in the cities themselves. And a lot of smart city conversations talk about transportation and city infrastructure. But if you really take a look at the impact that you can have across a city, you can't ignore the buildings themselves. So my focus at JLL is on our smart building program in terms of how do we make the buildings connected and more intelligent and operate more efficiently and really create a better workplace, not only for the occupants of the buildings, but for the city itself. And once you get the building smart and the building is connected, now you can also connect to the city infrastructure, such as the smart grid, such as parking. I mean, when you're talking about smart parking, most of the parking spaces or the parking lots are going to be in the buildings themselves. So what I bring to some of these conversations with Smart Cities conferences is the conversation around the buildings themselves, and how do you get the buildings connected, how do you connect the smart buildings to that smart city conversation.
So now I agree with everything you just said, and I've always been, as I said a little while earlier, when I got into this phase of my career, my job was working for an architectural and engineering firm to develop integrated smart buildings. And it's been a long, hard ride, as we can agree. I just happened to get involved in the New York City subway as one of the multi-faceted projects I've been involved in. That was the vehicle for us to build infrastructure, but we purpose-built it beyond the New York City subway. We purpose-built it using a 864-strand backbone to support light poles, the subway, buildings, and all of that. And it's still living and breathing. It's that smart technology's out there. It's almost 105 miles of fiber and a hell of a lot of fiber. Here's the real fiber guru. But that's where we're evolving to, and it's going to get more robust as we get into 5G, which I don't think we can even really cover in this podcast. But 5G is going to drive a lot of innovation, and cities, which we will touch on, with the things they need to prepare for, and buildings, real estate investment trust, of what's going to start happening to make your building smart, but more efficient. And I've learned some interesting things from you this evening, thank you, about 330-300. I really love that. I'm going to always remember that.
There you go. Well, I tell you, the challenge comes in when you transition between the public space and the private space. And so when you look across the city, there's a lot of the infrastructure that is owned and managed and controlled and run by the city itself. But even in the subway, you've got, city stakeholders, public. It's a public infrastructure.
Right.
And so
in New York, it's a state infrastructure in a city environment, so it's complicated.
But you're always going to have that challenge when you cross over into privately owned facilities.
Exactly right.
And even when you talk about real estate investment trusts, they account for a small percentage of the ownership of the real estate. So privately held real estate, and especially in New York City, a lot of privately held real estate. And as soon as you cross that line between public and private, you just run into a quagmire of problems in terms of who owns the infrastructure, and if it breaks, who's responsible for it, and what's the quality of service guarantees, and blah, blah, blah. And so at events like this, when we're talking about smart cities, we have to bring that conversation full circle. We have to talk about what's the relationship between the public sector and the private sector in terms of creating that universal infrastructure, that ubiquitous communications platform that they can both ride on. Right. And that's the internet.
Yeah, and it's one of the most interesting things about smart cities, and one of the things I thought was so encouraging about the discussion this morning is you had public sector officials and city employees, federal staff, leadership saying, yes, absolutely, you're right. This is going to be really messy, and this is the future. We're willing to think long term about this, as opposed to historically, you've had the private sector innovating, doing their thing over here, and then trying to retrofit into cities and states and federal government issues, and it's just a logjam. And this, I'm maybe Pollyanna, but I think it's an opportunity to really kind of talk about unique partnerships. Do you think that's too optimistic, or is it possible?
I think you're right. That's what I got out of the keynotes this morning, was a positive attitude, and you said it earlier, where not elected officials, but from White House, telecommunications, senior telecom people, all of that, admit it. Government gets in the way, sure. And they've created this Global Cities Innovation Initiative. I can't remember the acronym, but they started the initiative in December, and they're going to be awarding in 2 weeks. Yeah, and so actually, that's pretty impressive.
The cool thing about that is Austin's one of the final, I think, final seven or so.
6 or 7.
Pardon me?
Final 7.
7, that's what I thought. And we've kind of gotten it down. So it's interesting. And both Chelsea and I are here locally. I spent 25 years in New York City. I think one of the things that's interesting is to think about this problem at scale, but then think about how can we bring it down to smaller cities, and how do we effectively get stuff done. The challenge in smart cities, there's a lot of rhetoric. Right. And I have to say, I've watched 4 generations, right, Mark, of smart city conversations, and I'm kind of tired of just the rhetoric. So the question, and this is why I asked you to come down, Mark, is I think you have such a wealth of information around how did you get a New York City deal done with a public-private partnership, whereas, I mean, I think New York City wasn't really even the key element. It was the MTA, but the ability to talk a little bit, if you would, just share with us sort of the process and the patience maybe that it took.
Well, I'll use an old phrase and say it takes a village. My business partner, Jeff Justice here, and I was introduced to him many years ago, and he was really the driving force behind it. He needed a technologist to help him.
Yeah.
And essentially it was about 5 years of pushing the Department of Information and Technology, AKA Do It in New York City, to get bids out to and they wanted to. These were
So you went through the bid process.
We helped them develop
the bid.
Classic.
Like whoever's in the
they
RFP
need help. We don't
gets
know
to
what we're doing, right? Okay, let us help you.
Okay.
We helped them, and these were initiatives from, I would say really Bloomberg was a huge driving force behind the wireless in New York City. So the agencies were all under the pressure to get it done, but bureaucracy, it took a while. Same thing, a major wireless carrier wanted to get into the subway system because they had the forethought that, which I'll explain in a minute why the forethought was so great, is there's 7 million riders a day in that subway system. It's the largest subway infrastructure, the only infrastructure that's 24/7 with express track, hard to deal with. And when we went in there, you can't mess with their operation. That's their main thing. Safety, operation, delivering passengers is their business. That took a while, and it was really, I would say, the drive of Jeff for all of us, and then myself really technically driving and get the MTA to accept us, get Do It to accept us, and the real lessons learned, which we're going to be speaking on a panel in the conference on Wednesday, is for large or small. Just as an example, I won't name the town, but my cousin is in economic business development for community small cities, and I'm explaining to him what I'm doing. He's like, "Oh, can you come talk to us?" And I'm like, "Absolutely." I mean, the things that 4G, but really 5G are going to do. 5G is going to miniaturize everything, less power, less heat, and much more bandwidth, like supercharged bandwidth than you can ever imagine. And it's really for, again, smart cities innovations isn't just about technology, as I've learned this week, but technology is an enabler for it.
Right.
And municipalities need to prepare for the infrastructure.
So we have a technology opportunity coming.
That's
now,
correct.
I want to pause that just a second. Let's go back, if you would. I want to kind of dig a little bit more into how in the heck did you get, and like what were the key elements of getting a deal done with New York City? Like from a strategy
standpoint?
If you're a supplier and you're trying from a strategy standpoint, how can you help a city be smarter as it relates to its infrastructure?
Well,
Help it help itself.
Right. Well, so
in spite of itself.
I'll give it 10 seconds on the subway, because most cities don't have subways. But on the subway, subways are very unique environments.
Yes.
New York's over 100 years old now. It's probably 114 years old. What infrastructure we had to put in there, we had to literally invent ourselves and have it built and go out to RFP, because what was off the shelf wouldn't work. With Do It, which is an outdoor environment, we essentially worked with Do It to say, come to a mutual agreement. What would be commercially acceptable to what would be environmentally acceptable? And literally we went to Do It brought us to high-end, they had a competition, and we went to a high-end art firm that developed the box that we can put equipment in.
So you went through a competitive process.
Well, we went through a competitive process to get a franchise, but they had artists that had gone through a competitive process to win the light pole infrastructure. Nothing to do with radios, wireless technology, just light poles. And then that firm was awarded the contract to develop the box that we can stick our equipment in. And we had to work with them to make sure that it would cool and keep bugs out and meet the environmental specifications. Right. And it really was groundbreaking nationally and maybe beyond nationally, but it's just a lot of lessons learned of rights of way, things that you can mount on, things that you can't mount on. And how do you get that process going? And do it up front. It's gotten to a much better and more efficient process.
So Chelsea and I have thought about this as it relates to Austin. We're a classic town, innovative, lots of software developers, and yet we're a city. And so if I were to ask you, what are the 3 keys to basically being able to build a next generation of infrastructure with a city? It's a little tough, but give me
my engineering
mind's like
questions at me.
I have to give you like a David Letterman top 10 list.
That's
But
right.
I mean,
Nice.
but the idea of being able to say, hey, like if you were to approach a city, and you've done a couple different cities,
Right.
what are the key elements? 3 of them. Just give me top 3 to being successful at partnering with a city to help bring technology to be differentiating and provide a service, whether it be for the city. I mean, for one of the things, as an example, Mark, here in Austin, we don't have a subway. We have a train system that's minimal, but we do have, for example, an energy utility that could be rights of way, right, for RF
That's
infrastructure. So let's just take this on a generic case. What would be your strategy to be successful in a city like
All
Austin?
right, so let's to prong 1, and I'll add the 4th thing that has to do more with what Darlene said about buildings. And I'll start with that first. One of the most interesting things I found about putting all this fiber in the ground in New York City and then trying to get into buildings is there's a conduit, typically a 4-inch conduit, and there's multiple conduits going into the building. Who owns that conduit?
Exactly.
The building doesn't necessarily own it because they
No.
made a deal with
The
Verizon
carriers,
or
right.
Time Warner.
Right.
So somebody owns that conduit. A lot of time people just say, oh, there's a hole, let me put my stuff in there. And they're like, hey, who put their cable in my hole? I mean, just to think of it at that level, that's how complex this can get. And this is
But, you know,
what
let-
Darlene deals as a real estate
No,
person.
no. So
Let's finish the 3. We'll come
Let
back
me
to you.
get
I
to
want
the 3 things.
Because I know you're going to segue. This is a perfect segue. So we're
Right.
gonna, top
So-
3. I'm going to
So
force
that
you
was,
on the
I
top 3.
apologize. It just when you were talking, that was just a lesson learned. Was like, oh my God, you're kidding me.
Ownership
We'll get
issues.
to it.
I have
Access to the
Ownership.
building is
I
a
have to
key
deal with
issue.
the owner,
Ownership,
in between, and
liability.
the city, and the state, because you might be on state or city right away. Depends on where you are.
Okay.
Because we're in Austin and there's no subway, okay? We didn't use the rights of way for the subway to run our cable anyway, because, like I said earlier, we wanted to use the city right away so that we could go to buildings or go to light poles or kiosk and do other things. In Austin, what would be first and foremost important to me as a developer that would want to come into the city would be to work with the city manager, city managers, and get rights of way agreements. And whether it's with a power utility, New York City, for example, you get a franchise. There's what they call the Empire City Subway System, which is the
Right.
duct system in
Everybody,
Manhattan.
yeah, they manage the drug system.
You know well.
Yeah.
In the other 4 boroughs, we didn't deal with Staten Island for the subway, but we designed outdoor systems for Staten Island on poles. But you're dealing with Verizon, Time Warner Cable, Cablevision, whoever owns the pole.
Right.
And you design to that, and just because you design to that doesn't mean you get it. You have what's called make-readies, and that's when all of the entities that are on that pole get to go out and say, no, I want you to move this here, I want you to move that there. So those are things that you can't necessarily mandate because those are things that are already in and there's infrastructure there. But the easier a city or a municipality can make that process, like have it ready for you.
Support.
Is there a process where you can help the city manage that? I mean, I have some compassion for what a city infrastructure and the staff and the elected officials go through as all of this is getting invented. They're not in the habit of doing this. So how can we help educate them and guide
Right,
them to
and
where
that's
it's great
where-
for the city and great for the citizens ultimately?
And I named it. We met with a gentleman today that works with cities, not necessarily from the infrastructure part, but just from the relationship part.
Oh, interesting.
That I was like, wow, I wish I met you 15 years ago. And the thing about it is, and I don't know how eloquent I'll be about this right here, but it's going and having those relationships where now I've met somebody that can go have those conversations and say, look, this is what you need to plan for. That somebody's going to want to come in and put fiber down your streets. Are they micro trenching, which is basically putting a knife in the ground sideways and kind of slitting it open and dropping stuff in below the frost line? You know, or are we going down deeper?
We don't have a huge frost line here, by the way.
I know. Hey,
Just saying. I mean,
global
Sauna
climate
line.
change, brother. I've seen it snow in Texas. I've been here.
okay.
But
Just 2 cents.
the bottom line, but the bottom line is that's the first thing
Yes,
is the
absolutely.
right-of-way agreements, getting from milepost to milepost, right?
Yeah.
Then it's the attachment agreements. What can I attach things to,
Yeah.
right? And then it boils down to the support of the logistics of the community, whether it's the city manager, the utilities, other utilities, Department of Transportation. It's getting them all aligned and all in a room together to say, look, this is what we need to do, and this is how we have to do it. That gets the city moving forward and moving forward fast.
So there's a need for collaboration. That's what I heard.
Collaboration, and those are really the three. It's bring the players together,
Right.
get the rights away, and get the attachment rights
Right.
to do things.
Okay. Darlene, you're like you're
So,
itching, you're itching over there.
I got to jump in here. So back in the 90s, a smart building was a building that had internet access, right? So now we're having the same conversation around cities. Okay, what you're talking about is creating a communications infrastructure. Even running wireless through the subway, it's a communications infrastructure. So let's just assume that the city has a communications infrastructure. Whether
Really?
it's telecom, just work with me here, okay?
Don't
What we're
don't
talking
go
about.
there.
You're talking to all right,
So
well,
we're going back, guys.
You're talking to two
We're
fiber guys.
going back 20 years here in this conversation. Where we need to be going is forward in terms of once you have the communications infrastructure, whether it's wireless or hardwired, let's talk about what do you do with it once you have it there.
Okay.
And that's where the intelligence comes in, because once you have that infrastructure, once you have the ability to communicate over wireless or internet or whatever your communications platform is,
Sounds like Nirvana a little
that's
bit.
where
but
the
all right,
intelligence
good.
comes in. Because, okay, work with me. You had your 15 minutes of fame. You just need to zip it. So when you talk
why I love
about,
Darlene. She was
you
my partner,
put
by
the
the way. We were-
communications
She
infrastructure
told me
in.
to zip it a
So
few
you got
times.
wireless. Okay, you have wireless in the subway. That's phenomenal. Great. Everybody can
Right.
use their cell phones. They have Wi-Fi. But what are you doing with it? Do you have any intelligence in terms of real-time traffic flow, real-time trains coming into the
People are
subway?
writing apps
Are
for
you
it.
are you integrating it with your lighting and your access control and your security system and your cameras and your digital signage? Are you integrating all of those systems together now on the same communications platform? So we're sharing intelligence and we're making that subway smarter, not just from a communications standpoint, but from a data, analytics, fault detection and diagnostics. That's what we're talking about when you start getting into smart buildings. It's not, you had your 15 minutes, just zip it. So it's not just getting in and putting in the communications infrastructure. It's what do you do with the data now that you have the infrastructure there. So when you get into smart buildings, you're looking at real-time energy consumption, and you're looking at real-time use of space, and you're looking at real-time occupant demands, and you're looking at
Explain the
real-time
330-300 to people.
and you're looking at real-time integration with the grid. So the 330-300 goes back to the value of the intelligence that you can now communicate over that network. And it's not just about energy savings. It's not just about communications per se. So when you look at 330-300, the average customer spends about $3 per square foot per year on energy. And most people focus on the energy piece of this value conversation. But if you take a look at what the average enterprise spends on real estate per square foot, it's $30 per square foot per year on real estate, but $300 per square foot per year on their workforce per person. So if you look at 330-300, you've got the cost of energy, the cost of real estate, and the cost of the workforce. If you start applying this communications platform, which you are very successfully installing in city infrastructure, whether it's subways or light poles or DAS systems in buildings, that's the communications platform. That's phase one.
Agreed.
The next phase is what do we do with it? Let's take the information we can now get from that communications platform, the real-time occupancy information, the real-time use of space data, the real-time how do I like my office in terms of temperature and lighting, and the real-time being able to use that same communications platform for access control and for digital signage and CCTV and for video surveillance to be able to see if somebody left a backpack on the subway platform that shouldn't be there, and the smart camera identifies it and communicates that back to a security checkpoint. I mean, the platform is one thing. The data and the intelligence that you can transmit over that platform is really what is transforming cities from just being a communication city to a smart city.
And
That's right,
so
the
cool.
analytics.
In the smart cities conversation, you have so many municipalities who start with the problem. So Austin's conversation about this is because we're all tired of sitting in traffic. We're one of the top cities in the nation for traffic congestion.
I live in Washington, D.C.
We're close, neck and neck.
You can't even beat it. It probably took me less time to commute to Austin than it does to get into Washington
I
every
believe
day.
it, and we don't want to head that way. But most cities start with the problem and then work towards the solutions, which they understand exactly what you're talking about. But it requires that foundational support. So well put, stage 1 and stage 2. So it's just fantastic. You think we would have scripted this, which we didn't, which is kind of amazing.
Well, but even now you can
Well,
pull up your
Chelsea-
smartphone and see a map, and you get real-time data and analytics that show you traffic.
Yeah.
And that show you don't go this way, go that way, because
Right.
it'll take you less time, to get to
Just
work.
imagine we have 5G, it'll be
So today's a
instantaneous.
conversation around building blocks, and this is the beginning of a continued conversation. But imagine, and I was really excited about inviting the Fireware guys to this conversation, because when you look at a ubiquitous, once you have, and this is not an assumption, but once you have and you're smart enough to implement a ubiquitous communications infrastructure, which most cities do not, the opportunity for 5G is a whole nother value proposition and a whole nother network design. Now, assuming that we
It's
have
coming
that.
soon. They're already foundering the silicon, so this isn't something pie in the sky.
Right.
It's happening.
And so technologists like us can design that. The problem is cities have to empower
That's
the
right.
right
The
business
policies have to
model.
be in
The right
place.
business model. And I always talk about the elephant and the monkey. The city's an elephant. We need monkeys to basically be agile and create the technologies and work with leading this conversation, so we have the strength of a city and a monkey on the back to make it work. However, once you have ubiquitous communication infrastructure, you need actually a middleware to support all the ecosystem of development, to what
Right.
Darlene's saying for a building. We've watched it in buildings for years, and it took years to develop this. And so there's a whole bunch of conversations that we want to curate over a period of time that talk about the level 0 and 1 and 2 and 3 in the OSI stack,
Right.
that talk about the network infrastructure, but then the application middleware. And I can't wait to have the Fireware guys on here, which is really an EU initiative that has hundreds of cities in the collaboration of a middleware, open source, to support an ecosystem of universities and entrepreneurs to support all the creative ideas. So we're going to continue this podcast and continue this sort of video cast over a period of time. And I'm excited because Chelsea has you have such a great policy background. And we have to talk at some point about policies and government sort of intervention in this and support of this from both a state and a local level. And I look forward to having some state and local leaders. It'll be interesting.
Absolutely.
And actually, along with the technology people, but I want to thank you guys so much we've worn out our stay, I think, here tonight. But I'm so thankful, man. Darlene, I love you. You've been an amazing woman and just making a stand and really a difference in the whole commercial real estate community. I've watched you over your career and just been really honored to know you. It's an amazing just time to watch just the power that you've injected in typically a male-dominated world. You've been an amazing impact in that. And now you're at JLL. It's exciting. Mark, I've been impressed with just the experience that you've had in making. I mean, how do you make a New York City project work? You and Jeff, I've been really amazed to watch you guys in that. And so I've had a lot of fun in just watching this over the years. And our goal, I think, is to try to help raise the ability for us to kind of curate this conversation a little bit. And so thank you for being here. This is our, I guess, 1.0, right? After wine, this is probably the worst case scenario.
I think it's a great case scenario.
All right,
It's
well,
entrepreneurial. We're just
everybody.
figuring it out,
Salute.
just like the rest of Smart Cities.
Welcome to Austin, Texas, and
Salute.
we look forward to
Cheers.
continuing the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks.
Signing off.